Though Tuvia decided that the esoteric teachings weren't for him, he had a steadfast belief in everything the sages had written. And among the great Kabbalists, the Ari, may his memory be a blessing, was at the top of the line. If he had left a special healing blessing in his mikveh, then Tuvia was convinced the boy would be healed. The city of Zafed was literally up in the clouds. As they ascended the mountain, gusts of wind whirled around them, blowing flakes of snow in their faces. The entrance to the city was guarded by a wall of fog and mist, as if only the privileged could enter. For several long moments their horse disappeared in the vapor in front of them. Then the curtain of fog seemed to part, revealing a mystical enclave which seemed to hover in the sky on the platform of the clouds. Reaching the city was like entering another world. For one thing, Tuvia did not see any Arabs or Turks. Ever since the time of the Second Temple, for nearly 2,000 years, Jews had lived in this ancient mountain enclave. There the Jews found refuge from invading armies, building a spiritual fortress which no foe could threaten. The roadway had never been smooth, as if no one bothered about the physical comfort. Buildings were crumbling ruins. A series of devastating earthquakes had left rubble everywhere. A legend claimed that the disasters had happened because of the awesome power of the Kabbalists' prayers. The houses still standing were built out of large blocks of stone. All of the Jews who passed by on the roadside had long, untrimmed beards and burning, mystical eyes. They darted swiftly down narrow alleyways, their eyes on the ground, their thoughts up in heaven. Most of them lived on charity sent by Jews from overseas. They spent their days fasting, engrossed in study and fervent prayer. When Tuvia asked the way to the famous mikveh, they all pointed in a direction away from the town, down a sloping hillside. The steepness of the descent was frightening. Tuvia's horse balked. At the outskirts of the old picturesque village, the road ended and the wagon came to a halt. Tuvia took the towels that Bathsheba had packed with the food and an extra blanket to make sure that Moshe didn't catch cold. A narrow dirt path led to the ancient mountainside cemetery of Zafed. Many of the tombstones were cracked. Though the earthquakes had made ruins of the city, the greater part of the cemetery had been spared. A group of Hasidim stood reading psalms at the gravesite where the Ari was buried. Day and night, supplicants prayed at his tomb. Candles burned at the monument. A short distance away was the grave of Rabbi Yosef Karo, author of the great Shulchan Aruch. Further down the hill was the tomb of the prophet Hosea and the cave where the martyred Hannah was buried with her 7 slaughtered sons. A serene, holy stillness hung over the mountainside. Even Bathsheba, who was normally skeptical, could sense the mystical pull of the site. She walked beside her father, not saying a word. Moshe opened his eyes and stared at the cemetery. Only God knew what the small boy was thinking. "That must be the mikveh," Tuvia said, pointing at the mouth of a cave where a Hasid was standing.
"I'll wait for you here," Bathsheba said.
"There's a woman in the cemetery. Go and pray by her side."
Embarrassed, Bathsheba hesitated. She stood awed, feeling that all of the holy rabbis were gazing at her from their graves. She felt shame as if her lapse in faith made her unworthy to pray in so sacred of a place.
Carrying the boy in his arms, Tuvia descended toward the mountainside cave. Its entrance was a narrow archway in the rock. Inside, candles burning on a ledge lit the darkness. The walls were all solid stone, as if the cave had been carved out of a gigantic boulder. Deeper into the cave, an underground stream flowed into the natural pool of the mikvah. The shadowy figure of the Hasid appeared behind them. Without questioning Tuvia, he wished the boy a speedy recovery and asked if he could help. Tuvia let him hold Moshe as he quickly undressed. The cold, rocky floor sent chills through his body. In the flicker of the candlelight, he saw the boy's big eyes stare questioningly at his grandfather. "Don't worry, my little one. You're going to get better, I promise." He stripped the boy bare and scooped him up in his arms. Careful not to slip on the wet, rocky slate, Tuvia inched toward the mikveh. He knew the mountain water was bound to be cold, but when his foot descended in the first stone step into the pool, he felt as if he had put his toes into a bucket of ice. His body trembled. Why prolong the agony, he thought. With a gasp, he rushed forward and leaped into the freezing mikveh. He carried Moshe down with him under the water, then let him go for the briefest of moments so the boy would be completely submerged in the pool. Then, with a shivering roar, he burst out of the water and lunged for the steps. The Hasid reached down and swept the boy into a towel. Tuvia's teeth chattered as he hoisted himself back up onto the floor of the cave. They dried and dressed the boy quickly, then bundled him up in the blanket that his grandfather had brought. When Tuvia finished dressing, he carried his grandson back out of the cave. The Hasid said that Tuvia could bring Moshe to the yeshiva up the hill to warm him by the stove. Tuvia readily accepted the offer. Quickly, so the boy wouldn't catch a cold, he followed the black-garbed Jew up the steep path. Outside the yeshiva, the Hasid stopped at a narrow alley and knocked on a door. An old kerchief woman appeared, and after a moment's explanation, Bat-Sheva was invited inside while her father took Moshe to the yeshiva. The study hall was filled with Hasidim dressed in long black frocks and fur coats. Many of them wore prayer shawls and tefillin. Tuvia felt like he had stepped into a yeshiva in Russia. Talmudic volumes, their covers torn from use, filled the shelves along the walls. An elaborately carved HaKodesh holding the Torah stood in the south of the study hall so that the prayers could be directed toward Jerusalem. The Hasid sat Tuvia and Moshe in chairs by a large metal stove. The heat in its fire rose around them, removing the chill from their bones. Within a minute, cups of hot tea were brought. Tuvia watched in wonder as Moshe took the cup in his hands. He sipped the warm, fragrant brew and smiled. "Drink, my child," Tuvia told him, amazed at the improvement that he saw. Every second, the boy seemed to look stronger. For the first time in days, color returned to his face. A plate of biscuits and small pastries was set before them. Eat, Tuvia said, handing the boy a sweet-smelling cake. Moshe ate the tasty morsel with relish. Happily, his grandfather held out another.
"I want to go pray," Moshe said.
They were the first words the child had spoken in days. "Eat another piece of cake."
"Later," Moshe said, standing up.
"Are you sure you have the strength?"
"Hashem will give me the strength," the boy said.
To Tuvia's surprise, the boy didn't stand up to pray in the yeshiva. He walked to the door and hurried outside. Like a deer, he ran down the hillside path which led to the cemetery. Tuvia watched in amazement. Chills shook his body, but not from the cold, but from the miracle he was witnessing. As if the boy had lived in the city of Zafed for a lifetime, he ran straight to the grave of the Ari, praying, his little body swaying back and forth like the Hasidim who were praying beside him. Tuvia looked up at the sky and said thank you. With joy in his heart, he walked down the dirt path to join his grandson in prayer at the grave of the holy Tzvi. Okay, other bits. Let's see, do we want something happy or sad? Happy. All right. It's cold. It's cold outside. Yeah, Simcha. That's right. Let's see. So not when Bat-Sheva dies. Because I will cry then too. Okay, here we go. All right. Do you remember? You remember from the movie that Huddle married? I mean, not Huddle. Yes, Huddle had married Perchik. If you've seen the movie, Huddle was from a religious family. Perchik was not religious at all. And they end up in Israel, actually, before Tuvia. And then they have a child, and Huddle decides that she wants to raise the child religiously, and Perchik does not. And so she leaves him, feels bad, goes back. It's very bad, so she leaves again, and they get divorced. So now she's living in the same settlement as her father. 413. Ever since her divorce from Perchik, his poor daughter Huddle had become the opposite of her usual happy, spontaneous self. "Why the sad face all the time?" Tuvia asked her. "You should be happy. Thank God you're finished with that scoundrel." But Huddle was not consoled. After all, Perchik had been her whole life. As an impetuous teenager, she had run away from home to marry the man of her dreams. Because of her love for him, she had torn herself from her family in all of their ways. She had followed after him to Siberia, and then when he had become disappointed and bitter with the revolutionary cause, she had followed dutifully after him to Palestine. Now she trusted in him and had shared all of his dreams. And then their great balloon ride crashed. He introduced her to Tolstoy, to Shakespeare, to Voltaire, and Abraham Lincoln, but what good did it do her now? She was alone. She was abandoned. She was betrayed. The rib she had shared with her husband had cracked. A part of her was missing. Bringing up their child kept her busy, But a child wasn't a husband. A child wasn't a man. Tuvia found it difficult to talk to his daughter. He didn't understand her deeper emotions. To his way of thinking, she was depressed because of the shame. After all, in the old country, divorce was unheard of. If a man and woman didn't get along, they learned to live with each other for the sake of their children. The stigma was so great that a matchmaker wouldn't even consider arranging a match for a person whose parents had separated. Nonetheless, Tuvia told his daughter, if a divorce meant getting rid of an unbeliever like Perchik, it wasn't such a terrible thing. In fact, it was a great mitzvah.
You don't understand me at all, she told him sadly. Unfortunately, you never have.
That ended their conversation. Perhaps it was true, Tuvia thought. After all, Huddle belonged to a generation that was far different from his. Their minds were full of questions. Simple answers weren't enough. Tuvia's simple faith was scoffed at. The wisdom of the sages, all of their insights, all of their pearls, were looked on as primitive prattle. For the young generation, the existence of God had to be proved. In short, sons and daughters grew up with minds of their own, and parents no longer knew how to answer their bewildering questions. Strangely, Tuvia didn't have the same problem at all with his wife. Oh yes, Golda died before they got to the Holy Land, which is very sad. But after a long time, he actually married one of the Yemenites' daughters, Carmel. Who's very nice. So, let's see. The Tuvia didn't have the same problem with his wife. Although she was almost the same age as Huddle, she understood Tuvia completely. Sometimes Tuvia felt that Carmel had slipped into his beloved Golda's soul. May her memory be a blessing. True, his young wife was from Yemen, and the Jews had lived there for centuries untouched by modern times. The thought of disagreeing with her husband had never entered her mind. Peace was achieved by giving in to the man of the house. And besides, she truly respected her husband's life experience and wisdom. But in Anatevka, living side by side with the Gentiles, how could a father protect his children from the modern world and the heretical culture it bred? It was no wonder that one generation didn't get along with the next. Outside of the ghetto, the world changed every day. Now there were automobiles, airplanes, telephones. The eternal truth stayed the same, but in the age of cameras and motion pictures, who was interested in dusty, worn volumes of the Talmud? So instead of getting into a quarrel with his daughter, Tuvia set his wife to find out what was the matter.
She needs a new husband, Carmel said, after spending a long evening with Huddle.
Tuvia's wife didn't know Spinoza, Mendelssohn, or Karl Marx, but she knew that Huddle needed a man. Did she mention anyone in particular? Tuvia asked.
No, she's still too hurt about Perchik to be thinking about getting married again.
Do you have any suggestions?
You know her better than I do, Tuvia's wife answered.
She's fiery and stubborn and filled with all kinds of highfalutin ideas. I remember she always liked music. That is, before she learned to read. Carmel was silent. Tuvia loved her for that. She knew when to speak up and when to leave matters to him. You know, that isn't a bad idea.
Who? Carmel asked.
Hillel. Tuvia's wife thought and nodded her head. Unless you think he's too old for her, Tuvia added with a grin. His wife smiled back. The great difference in their ages was a joyful joke between them.
Do you want me to suggest it to her?
No. That would end it before it began. If she thinks it's something I've planned, she'll say no, just for spite. She may have learned a big lesson about husbands, but I know my daughter. She's still stubborn and willful. We have to proceed with caution. Tuvia grabbed a bottle of wine, and without waiting another minute, he set off to the barracks where the bachelors all slept. The musician was leading a symphony for snoring. Tuvia sat on his bed and poked his friend until he woke up with a startled expression.
What's the matter? He asked.
It isn't good for a man to be alone.
You've woken me in the middle of the night to tell me it? Hillel asked.
It's time you got married.
Hillel wiped the sleep from his eyes. With whom?
Whispering, Tuvia related his plan. The lovelorn musician agreed with a big grin at once. As if concluding the transaction, the father of the bride handed the bottle of wine to the groom. L'chaim!
L'chaim, Hillel answered.
Singing the blessing over the wine in the traditional wedding tune, he raised the bottle to his mouth and drank. Then he handed the bottle to Tuvia. I can't. When I was sinking in the swamp, I made a vow to give up drinking.
This isn't drinking, it's a toast.
A vow is a vow. But if my daughter agrees to marry you, I will speak to the rabbi before the wedding to see if I can have a sip or two to celebrate such a joyful simcha. The very next day, outside the packing house of the colony, where Huddle worked packaging vegetables into crates before they were sent to market, a man started singing a love song behind her. It was Hillel. He had been transferred from the fields to the packing house to help speed the work. Though the other unmarried women worked along beside her, with a woman's intuition, Huddle felt that Hillel's ballads were being aimed in her directions. By their smiles, the other women seemed to sense it too. As his love songs continued, Huddle felt herself blushing. Without looking at Hillel, she fastened the lid on a crate of tomatoes and carried it toward one of the wagons. Yentl, the wife of the butcher, walked beside her.
Running away from a love song, she asked.
Nonsense.
He certainly isn't singing to me. I'm married, and so are Minnie and Ruth.
So?
And the other girls are too young to get married.
A minstrel doesn't need a reason to sing.
Perhaps not, but Hillel has been long-faced for months. All of a sudden, you show up for a visit, and he turns into a nightingale.
Again, Huddle blushed. Walking back to her heap of vegetables, she caught Hillel's eye. He stared at her with an unabashedly friendly smile, the kind of smile a religious man isn't supposed to extend to a woman unless he has serious intentions. With a polite, if frigid reaction, Huddle settled back to her work. Can I marry Hillel the minstrel, she thought. He was the age of her father, and lame. Not that lameness was a sin, but it certainly wasn't an attractive quality in a man. Why does a man have to be attractive? A voice inside her asked. Her husband Perchik had been attractive, and what had it gotten her? What good did looks matter if a man was an egotistical rogue inside? And in this world, in one way or another, wasn't everyone lame? No one was perfect except the Creator. So, if she was to look upon the shortcomings of Hillel, or anyone else. Now he was whistling. The sweet Sabbath song filled her ears. Though the lyrics spoke of a love between a man and a woman, she knew it was a song about a Jew's love for God.
Love Schmidt, she heard her mother's voice say. What does love have to do with marriage? A man and a woman are brought together to bring children into the world. They live in the same house to raise up a family. What does love have to do with anything? Cooking and cleaning, scrubbing, folding, putting up with a man's groanings and tantrums, that's love.
You're not a spring chicken anymore. Immersed in her thoughts, Huddle began putting the tomatoes into a potato sack. Yentl smiled at her kindly and pushed over an empty crate with her foot. She gave Huddle a wink as Hillel limped by, lugging a load of tomatoes over to the wagon. Oh, stop it, Huddle said. It was ridiculous. How could she marry a man that was her father's age? Just as her mind asked the question, a wagon rode over and stopped a short distance away from the packing house. A mountain of tomatoes had arrived, waiting to be crated and shipped. Tuvia was driving. Carmel sat beside him, holding their baby. The boy was big enough now to take along into the fields. While his mother packed the tomatoes, little Tzvi rested nearby in the shade of an improvised lean-to. With a big, happy grin, Tuvia got down from the wagon. He held out his hand and helped Carmel climb down with the child. How happy they seemed, Huddle thought. Though her father was much older than Carmel, they looked like a match made in heaven. That's as far as we planned, but they do get married, and they're very happy. So, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.